The mud hit my shoes before I even understood what was happening. Kayla stood in my son's kitchen. My kitchen, if we're being honest about who paid for it, holding one boot in each hand, and she flung them at my feet like she was tossing scraps to a dog. "Clean these," she said. "I just had my nails done." I looked down at the streaks of brown mud on the tile I had mopped that very morning, and something inside me went completely still. "No," I said quietly. "That's all. Just no." And that's when my son Bradley walked in, took one look at his wife's face, and said the words that ended everything. "Apologize to my wife and do as she asks, Mom. Or leave." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I went to my room, packed the suitcase I'd never fully unpacked in the 8 months I'd lived under that roof, and walked out the front door without looking back. 1 week later, my phone lit up with 30 missed calls. But let me back up, because you need to understand exactly what my son didn't know he was standing on top of when he told his 61-year-old mother to leave. My name is Sandra. I raised Bradley on my own after his father passed when Bradley was only 9. I worked 2 jobs, days at a dental office, nights doing the books for a small hardware store, and I never once let him see me fall apart, even on the nights I cried into a dish towel so he wouldn't hear me through the wall. There were years when I skipped meals so Bradley could have new shoes for the school year. There were winters when I wore the same coat so many times the lining split at the seams, and I sewed it back together myself rather than spend money on a new one. I tell you this not for sympathy, but so you understand the kind of mother I was, and the kind of woman who was standing in that kitchen the day the mud hit her feet. When Bradley turned 26, he came to me with a girlfriend named Kayla Preston and an announcement that he wanted to buy a house. I had savings by then, decades of scrimping, of not buying myself new coats, of driving the same sedan for 11 years. I didn't lend him the down payment. I bought the house outright in cash, under my own name, and told him he and his future wife could live there for as long as they needed, rent-free, while they built their life together. I remember the day I handed him the keys. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and he said, "Mom, I will never forget this. Whatever you need, for the rest of your life, you come to me first." I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. He was still, in my eyes, the boy who used to leave dandelions on my pillow because he'd heard somewhere that mothers liked flowers. I moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment across town. I told myself it was temporary, that once they were on their feet, we'd figure out the paperwork properly, maybe put the house in his name, maybe sell it and split things fairly. I wasn't in a hurry. I trusted my son. That trust started eroding the week after the wedding. It began small. Kayla mentioned, almost as a joke, that my apartment lease was such a waste of money when I could just move into the house's guest room and help out. I said no, gently, wanting my own space. She brought it up again a month later, less like a joke. At the wedding itself, I should have seen it. During the toasts, Bradley thanked everyone who helped make this day possible, and listed caterers, his best man, Kayla's parents, and never once mentioned that the house he'd be bringing his bride home to had been bought outright by his mother's 30 years of double shifts. I told myself he simply forgot in the excitement. I told myself a lot of things that year. Then came the holidays. I'd show up with a dish I'd spent all day preparing, and Kayla would rearrange the table so my food sat furthest from the guests, closest to the kitchen door, like an afterthought. Bradley never noticed. Or maybe he noticed and decided it was easier not to say anything. By the second year, Kayla started asking me to babysit her sister's kids on weekends I'd already made plans for, framing it as family helps family, except the family help only ever flowed one direction. I once had to cancel a weekend trip with my own sister, Roberta, because Kayla called in tears saying she desperately needed me, only for me to arrive and discover she and Bradley had simply wanted a night out at a concert. I stayed home with 3 children under the age of 8 while my sister sat alone at a bed and breakfast I'd already paid a deposit for. I didn't say anything. I told myself that was what family meant. Then, 8 months ago, my apartment building sold, and my new lease tripled in price. I mentioned it to Bradley over the phone, not asking for anything, just venting the way a mother does to her son. He offered, his idea, not mine, for me to move into the house's spare bedroom, just until you find something better. I should have said no. But he sounded so much like the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, and some part of me wanted to believe we could be a family under one roof again. It was a mistake I paid for every single day for the next several months. Kayla treated my presence like a service I owed her. I cooked dinner most nights, not because I was asked, but because if I didn't, there simply wasn't dinner, and somehow that always became my failure. I watched her leave dishes in the sink for me to find in the morning. I watched her redirect Bradley's attention every time I tried to bring up finding my own place again, always with some excuse about how the market was bad right now, how it wasn't the right time, how I was such a big help with the house. She had a way of speaking to me in front of guests that made my skin crawl, sweet, syrupy, calling me Mom with a smile, and then the moment company left, reverting to sharp instructions, like I'd been an actress in a play and the curtain had finally dropped. I once overheard her on the phone with her sister, laughing about how convenient it was to have built-in help living down the hall, and how she didn't know what she'd do once the old woman finally moves out. I told myself I was being useful. I told myself this was what mothers did. But usefulness and belonging are not the same thing, and somewhere in those months, I stopped feeling like a person in that house and started feeling like a fixture, something they'd inherited, tolerated, and occasionally resented. There was one night, maybe 2 months before the boots, when I finally worked up the courage to talk to Bradley alone. I caught him in the garage, fixing something on his truck, and I said gently that I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own son's home, that Kayla's tone toward me had changed, that I missed feeling welcome. He wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Mom, she's just stressed with work. Don't take it personally." I wanted so badly to believe there was nothing personal about it. I know now that there was nothing but personal about it. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened before the boots, because it matters for what comes later. About 3 weeks before that morning, I overheard Kayla on the phone with a real estate agent, her voice low, almost giddy, talking about flipping the property and finally having something to show for all this. I remember standing frozen in the hallway, one hand on the wall, listening to her describe renovations to a house she didn't own, plans for a kitchen island, a conversation about market value in our neighborhood, as though the deed already had her name on it. When I asked Bradley about it later that evening, gently, without accusation, he waved it off. "She's just dreaming, Mom. People do that. It doesn't mean anything." I wanted to believe him. But some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years reading rooms and reading people, understood exactly what it meant. It meant they had already decided, in their own minds, that the house was theirs to plan around, theirs to imagine a future in, without ever once imagining a conversation with a woman whose name was on every document that made it real. I didn't say anything more about it. I filed it away, the way I'd filed away so many small warnings over the years, telling myself I was overreacting, telling myself family didn't calculate that way. I know now I wasn't overreacting at all. I was simply the last person in that house to admit what everyone else had already assumed. The morning of the muddy shoes wasn't even the worst thing Kayla had ever done. It was simply the last straw balanced on top of 1,000 smaller ones, and perhaps, if I'm honest, the moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for, a moment clear enough, ugly enough, that I could no longer explain it away. She'd been out walking in the field behind the house, training for some 5-kilometer run she'd signed up for, and came back through the garage in boots caked with wet dirt, tracking it clear across the kitchen floor. I had just finished mopping on my hands and knees because my back doesn't let me use the mop handle properly anymore. She saw the mess. She saw me standing right there. And she took off those boots and threw them, actually threw them, so they landed at my feet, mud spattering onto the hem of my slacks. "Clean these," she said, like I was staff. I said no. And that's when Bradley walked in, saw his wife's outraged face, and chose her side before he even asked what happened. "Apologize to my wife and do as she asks, Mom. Or leave. I want you to understand something about the woman I am. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything back. I simply felt, in that exact moment, 30 years of quiet devotion evaporate into something colder and clearer than anger. It was clarity. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw, for the first time, not the boy who fell asleep on my shoulder, but a grown man who had just chosen convenience over his own mother in the very house she had given him. And I understood, with a calm that surprised even me, that staying one more day would cost me something I could never get back. I went upstairs. I packed the same suitcase I'd carried into that house months earlier, still half unpacked because some part of me, I think, always knew I wouldn't be staying long. I walked past the kitchen where Kayla stood, arms crossed, smirking like she'd won something. I walked past my son, who didn't say a word, didn't reach for me, didn't ask me to stay. I opened the front door, stepped into the sunlight, and let it close behind me. I called my sister Roberta from the driveway. She didn't ask a single question. She just said, "Come now," and I did. Roberta lives 2 hours away, in a small house with a guest room that smells like lavender and old books. That first night, she made me tea and sat with me while I finally let myself cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, disorienting relief of no longer having to brace myself every time I walked into a room. Over the following days, something in me began to loosen. I slept without waking at 5 a.m. out of habit, bracing for whatever mood Kayla might be in. I ate breakfast slowly, at my own pace, without listening for footsteps. I sat on Roberta's back porch some mornings and simply watched birds at her feeder, something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember, because there had never been a quiet moment in that house to notice birds at all. I started making calls I'd been putting off for years, to a realtor, to my old friend Diane from the hardware store days, to a financial advisor Roberta had used for years and always spoken highly of. Diane and I hadn't spoken properly in almost 2 years. Somewhere in the exhaustion of living under Bradley's roof, I'd let so many friendships thin out to almost nothing, too tired most evenings to return a call, too embarrassed, if I'm honest, to admit how small my life had become in that house. When Diane picked up and heard my voice, she didn't ask why it had been so long. She simply said, "Well, it's about time," and invited me to lunch that same week. Sitting across from her at a little diner we used to visit decades ago, I realized how much of myself I had quietly packed away over the years I'd spent trying to keep peace in someone else's home. Diane didn't lecture me. She just listened, the way old friends do, and by the end of that lunch I felt more like myself than I had in longer than I wanted to admit. That's the call that changed everything. His name was Walter Grimsby, and when I explained my situation, that I owned a house outright that my son and his wife had lived in rent-free for years, that I'd never formally transferred the deed, that I was now living elsewhere, he asked me one simple question. "Sandra, do you still hold the homeowner's insurance policy on that property under your name?" I did. I'd never changed it. Bradley had never asked to take it over, and frankly, in the fog of walking on eggshells in that house, updating an insurance policy had been the last thing on my mind. "You should know," Walter said carefully, "that if you're no longer residing there, and the primary policyholder's address doesn't match the property, insurers sometimes flag that during a claim. It can complicate things significantly." I hadn't thought about it in those terms until he said it out loud. The house was mine. The insurance was mine. The property taxes came addressed to me. In every legal sense that mattered, nothing about that house belonged to Bradley or Kayla. They lived in my house, on my dime, under my name, and had for years. I hadn't left with any plan to use that against them. I want to be honest about that. I left because I could no longer breathe in that house. But 3 days after that conversation with Walter, my phone began ringing. It started with 2 missed calls from Bradley. Then 4 more an hour later. By that evening, the count had climbed past 20, and by the next morning, it sat at 30 missed calls and 11 voicemails I hadn't yet found the strength to listen to. Roberta sat beside me at her kitchen table while I stared at the screen. "You don't owe them an answer today," she said. "You don't owe them one tomorrow either. But I am, at the end of everything, still a mother, and curiosity and worry are harder to silence than pride. I finally pressed play on the first voicemail. It was Bradley, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. Mom, please call me back. Something happened with the house. The upstairs bathroom, the pipe under the tub, it burst overnight, and it's flooded down through the ceiling into the living room. We called the insurance company and they're saying there's a problem with the policy, something about the address on file not matching who's living there, and they won't approve the claim until they talk to you. Please, Mom. Please call. The second voicemail was Kayla. Her voice had none of its usual sharpness. It trembled. Sandra, I know things have been tense, and I know I said some things I shouldn't have. But this is serious. We have thousands of dollars in water damage, mold's already starting in the drywall, and the insurance company won't move forward without your signature and your updated information. Please, we need your help. I listened to 11 voicemails in total. Some from Bradley, panicked and pleading. 2 from Kayla, each one softer than the last, as if she thought a different tone might finally unlock the door she'd slammed shut herself. 1 oddly from Kayla's mother, whom I'd met exactly twice, asking if I could please just call the insurance company as a formality so her daughter wouldn't be living in a disaster. I sat with all of it for a long moment, and I want to tell you honestly, I felt no satisfaction in their panic. I felt something quieter than revenge. I felt seen finally, for the first time in years, in the sense that they could no longer pretend I didn't matter. The house that had sheltered their marriage, the roof that had kept them dry every single night, was mine. It had always been mine. And the moment I stopped being present to smooth things over, the truth of that arrangement rose to the surface on its own, with no help from me at all. I called Bradley back that afternoon. He answered before the first ring finished. Mom, thank God. Please, can you come look at the policy paperwork, or at least get on the phone with the insurance company? Bradley, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, I want you to think very carefully about the last conversation we had in that kitchen. You told me to apologize to your wife for refusing to clean mud off tile with my bare hands, or leave the house I bought with my own money. Do you remember that? There was a long pause. Mom, I know I was wrong, but this isn't the time. This is exactly the time, I said. Because you're calling me now, not because you miss your mother, but because you need something only I can give you. And I think we should both be honest about that. He didn't argue. I think, for the first time, he actually heard himself. I told him I would help, not because Kayla deserved it, and not even entirely because he did, but because I am still, underneath everything, a mother, and I wasn't going to let mold spread through a house while people I once loved figured out how to survive it out of spite toward me. But I told him my help came with conditions this time. I would call the insurance company myself as the rightful policyholder, but the moment the repairs were finished, we were putting the house on the market, and the proceeds from the sale would come to me, since my name was the only one on the deed. What happened after that, I told him, would be my decision to make. Kayla got on the phone at some point during that call, her voice thin and different from the woman who had thrown boots at my feet. She apologized. I let her. I didn't need the apology, but I let her give it anyway, because some people need to hear their own voice admit wrongdoing before they can move forward, even if the person they're apologizing to has already moved past needing it. There was a moment, near the end of that call, where Bradley asked quietly if I would ever consider moving back once repairs were done. I told him the truth. I told him that house had never really felt like mine to live in, only mine to give, and that giving it had cost me more than money. I told him some doors, once you finally walk through them, are better left closed behind you, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. The repairs took 6 weeks. The insurance claim went through once I confirmed my identity and updated the address on file. I never set foot back in that house, not once, not even to collect the last of my things. I had Roberta go with Bradley to gather them instead. When the house sold 4 months later, the full proceeds came to me, exactly as the deed said they should, no negotiation, no guilt trip strong enough to move me from it. I chose, on my own terms, to hand Bradley a portion afterward, enough to help him and Kayla get a modest start somewhere else. It was my decision to make, and I made it the way I wanted to, not the way anyone demanded. I used part of that money to help Roberta fix her roof, the one that had sheltered me the week I needed it most. I put the rest toward a small condo of my own, one with a garden I plant every spring, one where no one has ever thrown mud at my feet and demanded I clean it. A few weeks after the sale closed, Kayla reached out one final time. Not a call, but a message, long and carefully worded, explaining that she hoped we could start fresh now that the house was behind us, and that she'd learned a lot about herself through this whole experience. I read it twice. I thought about the woman who had once laughed on the phone about built-in help, about the boots landing at my feet, about the flipping plans whispered behind my back before I'd even been asked to leave. I wrote back 3 sentences, polite and final, wishing her well and telling her I thought it best we not stay in each other's lives. I have not heard from her since, and I feel no absence where that silence sits. Some evenings I sit on my little patio with a cup of tea, and I think about how strange it is that the very thing meant to punish me, being told to leave, turned out to be the thing that finally set me free. I think about all the years I mistook silence for peace and endurance for love. I don't think that way anymore. Bradley and I speak now, occasionally. It's careful and it's different, and I've made my peace with the fact that it may never again be what it once was. He visited once, a few months after the house sold, and stood awkwardly on my new porch, and said, "I didn't know what I had until you were gone." I told him that was, in its own way, the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. Kayla and I don't speak at all, and I've made my peace with that too. Because here's what that morning with the muddy shoes taught me, at 61 years old, after a lifetime of believing love meant absorbing whatever was thrown at me. The people who ask you to shrink yourself for their comfort will always eventually need the very things they told you didn't matter. And you don't owe anyone your silence just because you finally learned to walk away quietly. If you've ever been blamed for something that wasn't your fault, or told to leave when you deserved respect instead, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe to Sophie Revenge. We post a brand new story just like this one every single day.